It's funny how the same mouths that said they were done with you can't seem to stop orbiting your name. That's the thing about walking away from a chosen one. The echo never leaves. My dear chosen ones, let's talk about why your existence shakes people harder than they'll ever admit. Because whether you notice it or not, your presence hits like truth, sharp, undeniable, and impossible to forget. You don't just enter someone's life, you reorganize the emotional furniture, you tilt their axis, you shift their gravity, and the ones who pretended they didn't care, they feel it the most. See, there's a reason everyone keeps asking about you, even long after you've moved on. People don't check on what doesn't affect them. No one circles back to a bland chapter. They circle back to the part of the story that scared them, awakened them, exposed them, or taught them something they weren't ready to learn. And my chosen ones, you were that chapter, that turning point, that plot twist they still don't know how to process. They'll swear they're healed, swear they're thriving, swear they've evolved, but somehow your name keeps slipping out of their mouths like a confession they didn't mean to spill. They don't even realize it. Their subconscious is louder than their pride. It's almost scientific. The mind can't forget what shook it awake. And you, chosen ones, weren't an experience. You were a recalibration. Let's hit the truth hard. They're not curious about you. They're trying to self-soothe the bruise you left without ever touching them. You didn't wound them with harm. You wounded them with honesty, depth, presence. You made their emotional software glitch. You broke patterns they were loyal to. You made them feel things their comfort zone didn't have the bandwidth to process. And that kind of impact, it terrifies people who built their identity on being in control. Before we move forward, my dear chosen ones, take a moment to support the very platform that pours this energy into your life. If this message is hitting home, if it's unlocking clarity, strength, or that fire inside you, then show love by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support keeps this space alive, a space built to remind you of your power, your worth, and your evolution. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps us continue creating the inspiring, life-shifting, and empowering content you deserve. Stay with us, chosen ones. Your growth fuels our purpose. Chosen ones, this is where your power shines. You were never the issue. You were the upgrade they weren't prepared to install. When they caught feelings for you, it wasn't some cute moment of butterflies and fairy tale music. It was a system crash. Their inner voice whispered, "This person sees too much. This person feels too deeply. This person knows too clearly." And instead of rising to meet you, they panicked. Having feelings for you became dangerous, not because you're chaos, but because you're clarity. You make masks slip. You make facades crumble. You make people confront versions of themselves they've been hiding from. You weren't a crush, you were an awakening. That's why they still ask about you. That's why they stalk your growth from the shadows. That's why they pretend they're just checking in through someone else, as if no one notices the tremor in their voice when your name comes up. They're not over you. They're overwhelmed by what you represented. Chosen ones, let's answer the question you've had in your mind. If I was so unforgettable, why didn't they stay? Because people don't stay where they can't hide. Because not everyone is ready to be seen. Because your truth demanded their evolution, and evolution is a luxury many avoid. You didn't fail them. You exposed them. You didn't scare them. Their own reflection did. You didn't hurt them. They hurt themselves trying to avoid growth that your presence naturally awakened. And here's the part they'll never say out loud. They keep your name alive because you're the only person who ever made them question the script they were performing. You're the only one who made them feel real. That kind of imprint doesn't fade. It follows them, haunts them, teaches them. So sit back, chosen ones. Understand the weight you carry. Understand the impact you leave behind without even trying. The reason they keep asking about you, whispering about you, monitoring your evolution like it's breaking news is simple. Your presence didn't just touch them, it rewrote them. And the more you grow, the more they realize what they lost wasn't attention, wasn't validation, wasn't affection. It was access to a level of truth they still aren't brave enough to choose. Welcome, my chosen ones, to the reality of your power. The kind that doesn't just leave memories, it leaves awakenings. Chosen ones, before we dive any deeper into why everyone keeps asking about you and why having feelings for you feels dangerous to them, take a moment to anchor yourself right here with us. Your support is what keeps this entire movement alive. If this message is already hitting your spirit, if you feel that familiar pull of truth rising in you, show love by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and dropping a 77 in the comments so we know you're one of the few who truly understand their impact. Every bit of support helps us keep creating powerful, eye-opening content that exposes the dynamics others don't talk about. And now, let's step into the next part. Believe me, if you really are a chosen one, what you're about to hear will feel like someone finally putting words to everything you've been sensing, living, and carrying. Only the chosen experience this level of impact. Ordinary people never trigger reactions this deep. Let's get started. Number 1. They don't ask about you. They check whether you still shake their reality. They don't ask about you. They check if you still shake their world. It's wild how people claim you're irrelevant, yet they still flinch when your name enters the room. That's not curiosity, that's fear dressed as interest. My dear chosen ones, let's tear the mask off this truth. When people bring up your name, it's never casual, it's never harmless, it's never small talk. The air changes, the tone tightens, something in them flickers, like they've heard a sound they recognize but hoped they'd never hear again. And you wonder why, chosen ones. You wonder why people who supposedly moved on can't stop orbiting your existence like anxious satellites circling a planet with a gravitational pull they never understood. Let me say it plain. They're not checking on you. They're checking on the effect you had on them. They're scanning for aftershocks. They're testing to see if the emotional earthquake you triggered in their life is still active, still shaking, still capable of knocking down the walls they built to protect their comfort zone. You weren't a person to them. You were a disruption, a shockwave, a mirror they weren't ready to look into. And my chosen ones, mirrors make people uncomfortable when they've spent years avoiding their own reflection. You might ask yourself, why does my name bother them? Why does my existence still matter to people who don't matter to me? Because your presence exposed the cracks in their foundation. You made them face the insecurities they kept tucked under charm, excuses, and carefully rehearsed personalities. You made them question the story they told themselves about who they are. And people hate being forced into honesty when dishonesty has always been their safe place. Chosen ones, your name carries weight because you carry truth. That truth unsettles the ones who built their identity on performance instead of self-awareness. Every time someone mentions your growth, your progress, or your glow-up, there's a tension in them like a warning bell going off. They don't fear you. They fear what your evolution says about their stagnation. They're not asking, "How are you?" They're asking, "Are they still the version that made me confront everything I didn't want to face?" They hope you've dimmed. They hope you've slowed down. They hope you're distracted, off balance, or less powerful than before. Not because they want you to fail, but because your growth forces them to acknowledge they haven't grown. Every new chapter you step into becomes a silent reminder of the chapter they refuse to write for themselves. And they'll never admit this. Out loud, they play it cool. They act detached. They pretend your name doesn't tighten their chest for a split second, but internally, your evolution feels like an alarm clock they can't shut off. You might wonder, but why me? Why does my existence affect them this deeply? Because, chosen ones, you were the first person who didn't fall for their charm. You didn't crumble under their pressure. You didn't react to their emotional puzzles the way everyone else did. You stood grounded. You stayed centered. You moved with intention, not insecurity. That made you unpredictable. And unpredictability is terrifying to people who rely on control to feel safe. Your presence was the first time they realized that their old tricks, the ones that worked on everyone else, didn't work on someone built from clarity and self-respect. You didn't bend for them. You didn't shrink for them. You didn't soften the truth just to make them comfortable. You held up a mirror, and they saw their unfinished work staring back at them. That kind of impact doesn't fade with time. It lingers. Like an echo in a hallway they keep trying to walk through with their eyes closed. Chosen ones, understand this. They aren't tracking your life. They're tracking their internal reaction to your existence. They're checking if you still illuminate the parts of themselves they haven't dealt with. They're wondering if you're still growing, because if you are, they're forced to acknowledge they stayed the same, and that scares them more than losing you ever did. So the next time you hear someone is asking about you, don't mistake it for interest, nostalgia, or concern. They're running a diagnostic scan on their own unresolved feelings. They're checking if you're still dangerous, not because you bring chaos, but because you bring clarity. And clarity has always been too sharp for those who prefer the comfort of blurred truth. My dear chosen ones, let this remind you of your power. They don't watch because you're ordinary. They watch because you're unforgettable. They watch because you changed them without trying. They watch because your evolution exposes their excuses. And deep down, they know they're not ready to face the version of themselves you awakened. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of what you revealed. And that's why your name still shakes their world. Number 2. Your energy strips away. Every mask they thought would protect them. Their feelings for you are dangerous because you make their masks fall off. Some people don't fear losing you. They fear you seeing who they really are beneath the costume they've been performing in for years. My dear chosen ones, here's a truth most people choke on before they ever speak it. Catching feelings for you isn't some harmless little crush. It's a direct threat to the identity they've stitched together over years of pretending. When someone falls for a chosen one, they don't just fall, they unravel. Their mask slips, their practiced lines crumble, and the parts of themselves they've spent their whole life burying start rising to the surface. Nothing terrifies a masked soul more than the possibility of being seen in its raw, unfiltered form. Because let's be honest, most people don't walk through life as themselves. They operate through emotional costumes, carefully crafted personas, perfectly rehearsed behaviors that make them appear confident, composed, in control. These masks hide their uncertainty, their insecurity, their contradictions. They hide behind charm, behind humor, behind detachment, behind the polished personality they've perfected like a movie character they've memorized. But the moment they start feeling something for you, chosen one, that mask begins to crack. And it cracks fast. You don't chase, you don't manipulate, you don't fight for attention, you don't perform to be liked. You move from truth, grounded, steady, self-aware. You aren't impressed by ego games or emotional theatrics. You see through facades the way sunlight slices through a cracked window pane. You don't reward acting. You respond only to authenticity, and that alone makes their mask feel like it's melting off their face. Your presence forces honesty without you having to speak a word, and that, chosen ones, is what makes their feelings for you dangerous, not because you're overwhelming, but because you're real. Real in a world obsessed with pretending. Real in a world where love is filtered, scripted, curated. Real in a world where authenticity is often treated like a liability. So when someone catches feelings for you, it isn't something they can flirt with and casually walk away from. It hits them like a tectonic shift. It destabilizes their emotional balance because suddenly the shortcuts they've depended on stop working. Their distance doesn't affect you. Their charm doesn't distract you. Their hardened exterior doesn't intimidate you. You see the person behind the persona, and they feel that exposure like a spotlight they never asked for. That's what overwhelms them. That's what makes them panic. That's what makes the connection dangerous, not to you, but to the identity they've been hiding behind. You make them confront questions they've avoided for years. Who am I without this mask? Can I be real without falling apart? What if they see the parts of me I'm scared to face? What if they expect honesty I've never practiced? What if I can't hide behind my defenses anymore? You don't ask these questions verbally. Your energy asks them. Your clarity asks them. Your stability asks them. Because your steadiness exposes their instability. Your emotional intelligence reveals their avoidance. Your growth highlights their stagnation. Your depth exposes their surface-level habits. Your self-awareness shines a light on all the corners of themselves they've kept in the dark. You don't create their insecurity, you expose the insecurity they've been ignoring. That's why they pull away, act strange, become inconsistent, or suddenly feel overwhelmed. They're not running from you. They're running from the unmasked version of themselves that you bring out simply by existing. And here's the clearest truth. You don't demand authenticity, you inspire it. That's exactly why they fear you. You break their emotional scripts. You disrupt the patterns they've relied on. You dismantle the illusions they hide behind. You're the first person who doesn't allow them to perform their way through a connection. And for someone who has worn a mask their entire life, the moment it slips is the moment they feel the true meaning of danger. Not danger of heartbreak, danger of being seen, danger of being honest, danger of having to grow. Loving you isn't scary because of who you are. It's scary because of who they'd have to become. You're not the threat. Their truth is. And that's why feelings for a chosen one feel like stepping into a room without armor, exposed, unprepared, and undeniably real. Number 3. You awaken attachments. Their emotional toolkit can't handle. You ignite attachments they were never built to handle. My dear chosen ones, here's where things get raw. When people step into your energy, they walk into a terrain their emotional navigation system has never mapped before. You don't operate like the average person, so their instincts don't know what to do with you. Most people are used to connections that fit neatly into predictable patterns. Chase a little, pull back a little, act interested today, act distant tomorrow. They survive off emotional strategies, off scripts they've recycled in every relationship. Safe patterns, comfortable rhythms, familiar shortcuts. But then you arrive, chosen one, and suddenly the entire blueprint of how they've always interacted with people collapses. Being around you is not familiar. It's not predictable. It's not manageable. You're whole. You're centered. You're emotionally self-propelled. You don't need validation to feel real, and you don't need performance to feel desired. You exist from a place of internal grounding, and that's where everything shifts for them, because people who depend on control to feel secure cannot manage someone who doesn't give them anything to control. They can't manage a bond, they can't manipulate, they can't handle a connection, they can't influence, and they absolutely can't handle a person who doesn't respond to the usual games. That's why, chosen ones, the attachment you trigger inside people feels dangerous to them. It's not attraction, it's not a crush, it's a collision. It's the emotional equivalent of someone stepping off a familiar path and suddenly realizing the ground beneath them is deeper, wider, and more intense than anything they have ever explored. You pull them in without trying, and that pull terrifies them because they don't know where it leads. They don't know how to moderate it. They don't know how to slow it down. Their feelings become unpredictable because you are unpredictable, not because you're chaotic, but because you don't fit into the emotional formulas they've used on everyone else. You see, most people know how to survive in shallow waters. They know how to manage connections that never require accountability, introspection, or vulnerability. But you're not shallow water. You're a psychological ocean, your emotional depth, your clarity disguised as calm. So when someone feels drawn to you, their entire emotional system goes into a kind of shock. They feel the intensity, but they don't have the emotional tools to manage it. It's like handing someone a lightning bolt when all they've ever held is a candle. Chosen ones, they feel the attachment forming, and it scares them. They feel the magnetism, and they panic. They feel the pull, and they want to run from it even as they crave more of it. You force them to confront the emotions they've spent years avoiding. You bring up vulnerability they've buried. You spark accountability they've postponed. You activate parts of them they've kept locked behind emotional walls. You make them realize that connection isn't supposed to be a performance. It's supposed to be real, raw, and revealing. And that's why the attachment feels dangerous to them. Not because you're harmful, but because you trigger growth. You trigger truth. You trigger self-reflection. You highlight every pattern they've been hiding behind, the avoidance, the emotional shortcuts, the fear of intimacy, the fear of exposure. Being drawn to you is like being forced to step into a higher version of themselves they've never trained for. It's overwhelming. It's uncomfortable. It's undeniable. Even when they try to rationalize their way out of it. Even when they try to distract themselves. Even when they try to act unbothered, your presence sits in their mind like a reminder that shallow connections no longer satisfy them. You make their old life feel too basic. You make their old patterns feel too empty. You make their comfort zone feel too small. They know on some deep level that liking you requires expansion. It requires honesty. It requires emotional growth they've spent their whole life dodging. And that's why they don't know how to manage the attachment, because it demands a version of them they haven't become yet. Chosen ones, you aren't just a person who entered their life. You're a turning point, a shift, a challenge. You represent depth, accountability, and truth. 3 things that most people avoid until life forces them to confront it, and you, without even trying, become that confrontation. And that is the kind of attachment most people simply cannot handle. Number 4. They fear you because you're the one person they can't script or control. Being around a chosen one isn't like being around anyone else. And you, my dear chosen ones, need to understand the weight of that. Most people move through relationships on autopilot. They know the patterns, they know the moves, they know exactly how to play the emotional game to feel safe. They're used to connections that are predictable, easy to manage, and comfortably shallow. They know when to chase just enough to stay relevant, when to retreat to regain control, and how to keep things light whenever anything threatens to get real. That's the emotional script they've memorized, and it's the only one they know how to use. Then you walk in, chosen ones, and suddenly their entire strategy collapses. You're whole, you're self-contained. You don't cling, you don't beg, and you don't bend just to be chosen by someone else. You are not moved by their old tactics, and that alone terrifies them. You trigger attachments they were never trained to handle. Attachments that don't behave the way their previous connections did. Attachments that demand more depth, more honesty, and more emotional exposure than they've ever had to give. This is why their reactions around you feel unstable, confusing, and out of character. You operate on a level they've never encountered, steady, intentional, unshaken. So when they start catching feelings, it's not just attraction, it's disruption, it's emotional shock. It's like being pulled into a gravity field their heart wasn't designed to navigate. They can't predict you, they can't read you, they can't manage you. All the tricks that worked on everyone else fall flat the moment they try them on you. And chosen ones, this is where the fear sets in. Because the attachment they feel toward you isn't something they can control. It's not something they can manipulate or shrink into something manageable. It's magnetic, it's relentless, it's undeniable. Their mind says, stay calm, but their instincts say, pay attention. It's a pull that makes their rational defenses glitch. They feel drawn to you, but at the same time, terrified of what that draw might ask of them emotionally. Being attached to you forces them into territory they've avoided their entire lives. Vulnerability, accountability, emotional clarity, and introspection. You make them look inward, and they've spent years avoiding that. Your presence alone exposes the shallow patterns they've relied on in past relationships. Surface-level bonds, half-efforts, emotional shortcuts, and connections built on avoidance rather than truth. With you, none of that works. You don't allow emotional laziness, even without saying a word. You activate an internal pressure they can't escape, even when they try to distract themselves, detach, or pretend they don't care. Something inside them keeps circling back to you, because the feelings you create are not optional. They're alive. They're intense. They demand to be acknowledged. And the hardest part for them, they know, whether consciously or subconsciously, that caring for someone like you requires growth. Real growth. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that makes them face their patterns, their wounds, and their emotional limitations. Liking someone who lets them coast is easy. Liking a chosen one is like standing at the doorway of the life they could have, but haven't earned yet. It forces them to confront the gap between who they are and who they'd need to become. That's why the attachment feels dangerous. Not because you are dangerous, chosen ones, but because you represent a level of depth they've never reached. You are a challenge to everything they thought they knew about themselves. You make them question their habits, their coping mechanisms, their emotional avoidance, and their own capacity for real connection. You don't just enter their life, you expose it. And that level of reflection is something most people simply cannot handle. Number 5. Your realness makes their entire relationship history look manufactured. My dear chosen ones, this truth cuts deeper than most people are willing to admit. Your authenticity makes their entire relationship history look like a lie. Not because you tried to expose anything, not because you pointed fingers, not because you demanded explanation, simply because the moment they encountered you, something inside them shifted in ways they weren't emotionally prepared for. When people meet someone real, after spending years surrounded by half-hearted connections and recycled emotional patterns, it forces a comparison they never consciously choose. Their mind does it automatically. Your depth contrasts their old habits. Your clarity exposes their shortcuts. Your presence reveals the chaos they once labeled as connection. Suddenly, the stories they've been telling themselves about their past begin to sound flimsy, exaggerated, or downright false. The relationships they hyped up now collapse under the weight of what realness actually feels like when it finally enters the room. They never intended to question their entire romantic history. They never planned to look back and evaluate who they loved, why they loved, and how quickly they settled. But your energy forces an internal audit they cannot avoid. All those situationships they once romanticized now look like emotional bandages. All the attachments they bragged about suddenly seem childish. All the deep connections they swore were once in a lifetime now appear shallow, rushed, or rooted in insecurity. Without speaking a word, you shine a light into corners of their psyche they've spent years trying to avoid. You uncover the truths they buried, and that light, your light, shows them that most of their past wasn't meaningful love, it was emotional habit. People who rely on emotional shortcuts don't know what to do with someone who doesn't manipulate, doesn't perform, doesn't chase, and refuses to play games. They're used to predictable patterns, messy bonds built on convenience, fear of being alone, temporary attention, or emotional bargaining. They think instability is passion. They confuse chaos with chemistry. They mistake inconsistency for excitement. They've lived so long on emotional crumbs that when they finally meet someone offering real presence, real intention, and real emotional clarity, it feels foreign, almost threatening. Their past partners didn't challenge them, didn't reflect their patterns, didn't require emotional maturity, but you, chosen one. Your groundedness becomes the ruler against which all their previous experiences are suddenly measured. And the measurement is brutal. It's not your words that shake them, it's your existence. You are the living contrast to everything they've tolerated. You are the quiet proof that they've been settling for less than they deserve. You make them realize how much they masked loneliness with temporary attachments, how much they confused attention with affection, how much they stayed in relationships simply because leaving would require them to face themselves. You make them aware of how emotionally malnourished they've been, not because you criticize them, but because you embody what emotional nourishment actually looks like. You don't disrupt their narrative, you reveal it. And here's where the resentment grows, not toward you, but toward the truth you silently awaken in them. They don't resent your authenticity. They resent what your authenticity demands. Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that their past wasn't love, it was survival. Acknowledgement that their relationships weren't built on intimacy, but on routine. Acknowledgement that most of what they called connection was really fear wearing a romantic disguise. You didn't ruin their history. You didn't make it look empty. Their history was already empty. Your presence just made it impossible to ignore. For the first time, they can see how often they chose comfort over courage, how often they lowered their standards just to feel chosen. How many times they settled for half effort because they didn't believe they could have more. They realize they accepted breadcrumbs because they didn't know what a full meal tasted like until you came along with your clarity, your emotional self-respect, your ability to connect without needing to control. And once they see that truth, they cannot unsee it. They can't go back to pretending their past was meaningful when now it looks staged, shallow, or rooted in avoidance. Your authenticity didn't destroy their past. It revealed the quality of it. It stripped the illusion away. And that revelation, it echoes long after you leave. They will wrestle with it privately, replaying memories, re-evaluating choices, rethinking who they were. You won't see this battle, but it happens silently inside them. Your impact doesn't fade quickly. It stays, it lingers, it rewrites them from the inside out. You didn't show them the truth to hurt them, chosen one. You showed them the truth by being the truth. Number 6, you break their predictability system the moment you enter the room. My dear chosen ones, let's peel this truth open slowly, because it explains exactly why your presence rattles the people who thought they had life, and everyone in it figured out most people build their confidence on predictability. They rely on patterns, reactions, and emotional formulas. They watch how others respond, memorize what gets attention, what sparks guilt, what provokes fear, and what triggers attachment. This predictable cycle becomes their safety net. It becomes their identity. It reassures them that they are in control, that they can influence outcomes, that people will always respond the way they expect them to. The moment someone reacts outside of that script, they lose the illusion of power they built their lives around. But then they met you, and nothing made sense anymore. You didn't fit into any predictable emotional pattern they'd mastered. You didn't crumble under pressure. You didn't take the bait when they tried their usual tactics to test the strength of a connection. You didn't fall apart when they went quiet to see whether you'd chase. You didn't react with insecurity when they pulled away to measure their importance. Instead, you held your ground with the calmness of someone who has mastered themselves long before meeting anyone else. You moved differently, chosen one. You operated on a frequency they'd never encountered. Where others moved from fear, you moved from clarity. Where others responded from insecurity, you responded from self-awareness. Where others stumbled into emotional traps, you walked around them with your peace intact. That alone shook them to their core. You became the glitch in their system, the variable they couldn't calculate, the one pattern they couldn't predict. When they tried to provoke jealousy, you stayed unmoved. When they attempted to confuse you with mixed signals, you remained clear. When they tried creating friction to pull you into drama, you refused to abandon your equilibrium. They expected chaos, and you delivered calm. They expected desperation, and you responded with dignity. They tried to play emotional chess with someone who was not even sitting at the board. And that is what terrified them. You took away the one thing they relied on to feel secure: predictability. You didn't react to emotional manipulation the way others did. You didn't give them the satisfaction of watching you struggle for their approval. You didn't respond from wounds because you weren't living in them. You responded from awareness, from principle, from the grounded sense of self that most people never build within themselves. Chosen ones, your emotional stability disarmed them. It made their learned tactics useless. Their games fell flat. Their strategies failed. Their emotional choreography was met with stillness instead of panic. You unraveled the identity they had built around knowing how to handle people, because suddenly they had someone in front of them who could not be handled, measured, or decoded. It wasn't that they couldn't control you. Control was never the real fear. It was that they couldn't predict you. They couldn't figure out what you wanted because your desires weren't rooted in insecurity. They couldn't figure out what you feared because you didn't operate from fear. They couldn't find a weak point to hook into because you didn't present yourself with emotional holes to fill. You became an emotional outlier, something rare, something powerful, something they didn't have the emotional tools to manage. And here's where it hits deeper. Their entire sense of identity was built on being able to forecast reactions, being able to influence outcomes, being able to manipulate emotional energy around them. You shattered that identity simply by being yourself. Chosen one, this is why they found feelings for you so unnerving. Because falling for you didn't just stir their emotions, it challenged their worldview. It dismantled their confidence in their own emotional mastery. It exposed how little control they actually had. For the first time in a long time, they faced a connection where they weren't the one in charge of the narrative. You didn't take their power. You exposed that they never had any power in the first place. Not over you, not over truth, not over real connection. They weren't prepared for someone like you, a person who doesn't bend to pressure, who doesn't collapse under emotional games, who doesn't surrender their dignity to earn affection. Someone who stands firm, not because they're cold, but because they know their worth. So yes, chosen one, your unpredictability is power. It's the reason they couldn't manage the connection. It's the reason their feelings for you felt like a threat to everything they thought they understood about relationships. And it's the reason they'll never forget the day they realized they couldn't predict you. Because that was the day they lost the illusion of control they depended on. You didn't just break their patterns, you broke their entire emotional identity. Number 7, their pull toward you isn't desire, it's evolution dragging them forward. My dear chosen ones, let's break this open with the kind of clarity that rattles the walls they hide behind. The reason people are drawn to you has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with evolution. They don't feel pulled toward you because of attraction. They feel pulled because being near you forces their soul, their mind, and their entire emotional system to wake up from sleep mode. You aren't a crush, you're a catalyst. You're the moment the lights come on in a room they've been sitting in with their eyes shut. Most people live their lives half awake, moving through routines without questioning who they are or who they're becoming. They cling to familiar patterns, familiar fears, familiar identities, not because they fit, but because they're comfortable. They keep their emotions shallow, so they never have to swim into the deep. They surround themselves with connections that don't stretch them, don't challenge them, don't require anything real from them. Then suddenly, chosen one, you appear, and your presence disrupts their entire equilibrium. You activate parts of them they forgot existed. Their conscience sharpens around you. Their self-awareness amplifies. Their desire for direction, depth, and meaning begins to rise like something they can't push back down. You aren't triggering desire, you're triggering awakening. You stir their dormant potential, their abandoned goals, their ignored truths. They start to feel the gap between who they are and who they could be. And chosen ones, that gap terrifies them. This is why their attraction feels intense, confusing, and at times overwhelming. They aren't falling for you. They're falling for the version of themselves they glimpse when they're in your presence. They're falling for their own evolution, the one they abandoned long before you came into the picture. You're not the end goal. You're the mirror reflecting what they're capable of if they stop playing small. And that, my chosen ones, is why the pull feels so powerful. You represent potential. You represent alignment. You represent the life they could be living if they had the courage to change. But change is never gentle. It's never easy. It requires dismantling the excuses they've polished for years. It requires dropping the identities they've been using as shields. It requires unlearning habits, facing their own patterns, and accepting truths they've spent their entire life avoiding. Most people aren't ready for that kind of transformation, so instead of admitting that you awaken something inside them, they label the feeling dangerous. They say you're too intense, too different, too hard to handle, but the truth is, it's not you that's too much. It's their unhealed self that can't handle the evolution your presence demands. You don't just affect their heart, you affect their direction. You make them rethink their choices, question their relationships, examine their behaviors. You make them wonder why they've settled for so little from themselves. They feel the shift, even if they pretend they don't. They feel the urge to grow. They feel the pressure to improve. They feel the fear of staying the same. Being close to you is like standing at the edge of the life they always wanted but never dared to reach for. And that's why they pull back. They're not afraid of loving you. They're afraid of becoming the version of themselves they'd have to embody in order to keep up with you. Chosen ones, this is why their attraction feels conflicted. This is why they move toward you only to retreat. This is why they admire you, but keep their distance. You represent the bridge between who they are and who they could be, and crossing that bridge requires courage they haven't built yet. You are not the danger evolution is, and you are the embodiment of it. So understand this. When people are drawn to you, it's not romance calling them. It's their own potential waking them up. It's their spirit pushing them toward growth. It's their better self whispering, "This is the direction you're meant to go." But growth requires sacrifice, accountability, and honesty. And many will retreat because they're not ready to face themselves. You don't just ignite attraction, chosen one. You ignite transformation. And transformation is the one thing most people fear more than anything else. So if they pull away, don't take it personally. They weren't running from you. They were running from the evolution you awakened in them. An evolution they're not yet brave enough to claim. Number 8. Your presence exposes how small they've been living without even knowing it. You make people realize how small they've been living. My dear chosen ones, let's talk about one of the deepest truths people never admit out loud. Your existence exposes the tiny, cramped emotional rooms they've been living in. Most people spend their lives walking through invisible cages, boxes built from fear, routine, approval, and the desperate need to feel safe. They don't even know they're boxed in because their comfort zone has become their identity. They surround themselves with people who won't challenge them, habits that won't stretch them, and choices that keep everything predictable. It's not that they're incapable of more, far from it. It's that they've told themselves for years that more is too risky, too unfamiliar, too demanding. So they settle into smallness like it's home. Then you appear, chosen one, and without even trying, you make those walls close in on them. You don't lecture, you don't criticize, you don't push. You simply exist at a level of truth that makes the container of their life feel painfully tight. Your honesty highlights their avoidance. Your self-respect highlights their compromises. Your choices based on conviction, not convenience, highlight their excuses. You live from a place of clarity, while they live from a place of habit. You choose growth over comfort, while they choose comfort over possibilities. You move through life with alignment, intention, and awareness, while they drift through life on autopilot, hoping no one notices how stuck they really are. But you notice, and your presence alone becomes the mirror they didn't want, but couldn't escape. When they watch you, something inside them shifts. They start to feel the weight of all the potential they abandoned just to stay comfortable. They begin to recognize how often they've shrunk themselves to fit into relationships, friendships, jobs, circles, or identities that never matched who they truly were. They remember dreams they let die, goals they never attempted, strengths they suppressed, and versions of themselves they never explored. And none of this happens because you said a word. It happens because you live in a way that reveals exactly how little they've been asking from life and from themselves. Your lifestyle doesn't shame them, it awakens them. It whispers, "See? This is what's possible when you stop living small." And that whisper terrifies them more than anything, because once someone sees the truth, they can't unsee it. This is why they keep asking about you, not out of admiration alone, but out of measurement. Your evolution becomes the ruler they measure their own life against. Every time they hear about your growth, their mind rushes to ask, why didn't I choose that path? Why didn't I take that risk? Why am I still living the same year over and over while they're becoming someone new? They're not tracking your success, they're tracking their stagnation. Your progress keeps exposing the potential they've buried beneath fear and excuses. And let's be honest, your presence brings a kind of emotional brightness that makes their dimly lit life uncomfortable to sit in. They begin to see how deeply they've been settling for relationships that drain them, settling for habits that numb them, settling for environments that limit them, settling for identities that never belonged to them in the first place. You don't intimidate them with your accomplishments. You confront them with the realization that they could have been more long before they met you. But courage, they haven't built that yet. Expansion feels like a threat to those who invested everything into being the smaller version of themselves. That's why they hover, observe, and keep asking about you. You represent the life they could have lived if they didn't choose fear over possibility. You symbolize growth, movement, and evolution, things they crave but don't know how to chase. And even though they may envy you, they also admire you. Even though they fear what you represent, they're also drawn to it. Chosen ones understand this. You don't intimidate people by being larger. You intimidate them by showing them how small they made themselves. You don't overwhelm people with your light. You overwhelm them with their own shadow. You don't threaten their comfort. You threaten the illusion that comfort was ever enough, and this truth is too powerful, too real, too undeniable for them to ignore. You are the reminder of what they could be. You are the reflection of everything they buried. You are the proof that growth is real, and that is why your name never leaves their conversations. Number 9, you're the first connection that didn't depend on need, only truth. My dear chosen ones, let's dive into this truth with the kind of clarity that shakes the dust off every illusion they tried to build around you. When people crossed paths with you, they didn't just meet another person, they met a version of connection they'd never been trained to understand. You were the first person who didn't need them, and that alone rewired their entire emotional operating system. Most people don't know how to function in relationships that aren't based on dependence, imbalance, or quiet manipulation. They think they want love, but what they're really addicted to is control. They want someone who needs saving so they can feel significant. They want someone uncertain so they can feel stable. They want someone emotionally hungry so they can ration affection like it's currency. But then you walked in, chosen one, self-sourced, internally balanced, emotionally independent, grounded without anyone's validation, and steady without anyone's permission. Suddenly, the old script they'd been using, the script that always guaranteed them the upper hand, fell apart. They didn't know how to love someone like you because loving you required something they'd never practiced. Authenticity with you. They couldn't play the hero. They couldn't play the martyr. They couldn't perform their worth. They had to be their worth, and that is a level most people simply are not prepared for. Let's call it what it is. They weren't intimidated by your standards. They were intimidated by your wholeness. You didn't arrive broken, begging, confused, or lost. You arrived aligned. And alignment terrifies those who only know relationships through chaos. You came with no emotional debts for them to collect, no insecurity for them to exploit, no fear for them to soothe in exchange for loyalty. You were complete, and that made them confront just how incomplete they were. You might have wondered, why did they pull away when everything felt so real? Because real required them to drop the roles they'd been hiding behind for years. With you, they couldn't rely on their old tactics, the jealousy games, the silent treatments, the hot and cold push and pull nonsense. Those tricks only work on people who fear losing the connection. But you, chosen one, you've never been afraid of walking away. You don't cling, you don't beg, you don't barter your dignity to feel wanted. That's why they didn't know what to do with you. You broke the cycle they relied on to feel powerful. Most people feel valuable only when they're needed, not when they're chosen. You didn't need them, and that forced them to face the possibility that, for the first time, they'd have to earn connection through truth, not through control. They'd have to bring emotional maturity instead of emotional manipulation. They'd have to show up whole, not perform wholeness. And that's a level of vulnerability their ego was not ready to touch. Chosen ones understand this clearly. You didn't intimidate them by being too strong. You intimidated them because you didn't require them to dim your light, shrink your power, or validate your existence. You were the first person who approached them without asking for anything but authenticity. And authenticity is the one thing many people don't know how to give. With you, there was nothing to fix, nothing to rescue, nothing to dominate. They couldn't build their identity around being your savior or your superior. The dynamic they depended on, the dynamic where one person is the giver and the other is the taker, didn't exist with you. You stood eye to eye, not above or below. That's equality. And equality terrifies those who rely on imbalance to feel valuable. Instead of rising to meet you, they panicked. They misread your emotional stability as coldness because they're used to chaos being mistaken for passion. They misinterpreted your independence as rejection because they've only known love through neediness. They assumed your clarity meant you didn't care because they've never experienced a bond that wasn't fueled by insecurity. What you offered wasn't distance, it was depth. But depth feels like danger to people who've only ever swum in shallow waters. The truth is simple, chosen ones. You weren't hard to get, you were hard to control. You weren't unavailable, you were unmanipulable. And that's why they couldn't love you, not because you were unlovable, but because loving you required them to evolve, and they weren't ready to step into that version of themselves. You were never the challenge. They've handled challenges before. You were the mirror. And facing that mirror showed them everything they hadn't healed, everything they'd been pretending, everything they'd been avoiding. You didn't break them, you revealed them. And they didn't know how to love someone who could see them that clearly without needing anything in return. That is the true power of a chosen one, and that is why they couldn't handle you. And now, chosen ones, as we reach the end of this truth-filled journey, let this settle deeply within you. The reactions people have to your presence were never random. They were reflections, mirrors showing you just how powerful your energy truly is. You didn't just cross their path. You rewrote their understanding of what real connection feels like, and even after the story ends, they're still wrestling with the imprint you left behind. If this message awakened something in you, support this channel so we can keep bringing you powerful, life-shifting content. Like this video, hit subscribe, drop 77 in the comments to claim your path as a true chosen one, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your growth fuels this mission.